China. Of course, as Gordon Hanson made clear, we've already been talking about China, because all of the kind of technological changes and the economic changes that have been driving the issues we've been grappling with this morning are inextricably interwoven with China and China's emergence into a prominent place in the world economy. The question I want to ask today is whether China is now post-transition. What do I mean by this? If we go back 40 years, all the way back to 1979, China launched into a transition process. China undertook something, reform and opening. And since that time, of course, the path hasn't been smooth. There have been ups and downs. But for sure, since that time, China launched a transformation process that has changed everything about Chinese society, Chinese economy, Chinese policy, and of course, as the speakers this morning have demonstrated in multiple ways, the world economy, the US economy as well. And of course, everybody understands that that process led to a massive explosion of activity, a massive explosion of creativity, and a massive explosion of wealth. But beyond this economic miracle, there's another kind of, I'd call it a policy miracle, that has gone along with this fundamental economic transformation. Because one thing we can say about China from the beginning is Chinese leaders never knew where they were going. And they knew that they didn't know what they were going. In other words, the remarkable thing about this incredible transformation, and just remember how incredible it is, right? China has grown economically faster, longer than any economy in world history, right? And yet this transformation was achieved in a context where a set of leaders were pushing for change, but didn't claim to have any particular endpoint in mind, didn't claim to have a model or a destination. So instead, Chinese policymakers over this 30-plus year period grappled with problems. Easy problems, hard problems. In my many years looking at China, I've been struck by how many times outside observers have said, well, they've done the easy things, but now they have the hard task. Only to find that 5 or 6 or 7 years later, that hard task had been grappled with, whether it was property rights for farmers, whether it was state-owned enterprises, whether it was financial institutions, or whether it was allowing rural people to leave the farm and come to the city. So this process in which problems were gradually identified, gradually addressed, and gradually resolved has really been a distinctive feature of the whole Chinese transition process from the very beginning. And because it's been such a distinctive feature of the transition process, these very vague terms, terms like reform, what does reform mean? Opening, what does opening mean? These very, very vague terms actually have had some meaning because they were terms that made clear to many people the direction of change. They were terms that made clear to people the spirit of change. They animated a process that allowed a policy-making process to be adaptive, to be learning, to absorb characteristics of the status quo and decide, very much in the spirit of what Renee was saying, decide which features of the status quo should be at least temporarily preserved in order to maximize and allow the movement toward change and toward the future. In other words, when we think about transition in China, the successful period of transition in China, we need to think about a transition process that was powerful precisely because the content and the meaning of this transition was revealed only by the transition process itself. Now that's looking back. What about today? Well, the first thing that you find when you look at China today is that everything's changed. Now, of course, part of that is just because the speed of transformation has been so rapid. So many things have changed. But looking at it as an economist, one of the things I find so striking is that the fundamental tangible economic features of China, all those things that economists are pretty good at describing through numbers and other kinds of characterizations, those fundamental processes have changed. So for instance, China went through its transformational miracle growth period, this structural change from an agricultural economy to an urban industrial economy. But you know what? It's done. It's over. China went through a demographic dividend where a surge of young people flooded into markets and pushed up economic growth. And you know what? It's over. China's looking around the corner now at becoming an aging society. Instead of trying to limit births, now they're looking for ways to encourage people to have more kids. For a long time, China was forced into market reforms because there were bottlenecks or fundamental problems they couldn't resolve any other way. So they were willing to say, okay, we'll open up the structure of demand and allow the economy to go wherever it's opened up to. And now policymakers don't seem so interested in that anymore. They've decided that as they move out of this other structural transformation period, they need to tell the world what the new growth drivers are going to be. So they're publishing plans. They're publishing 2 or 3 plans a year that say we're going to be prominent in industrial robots, artificial intelligence, autonomous vehicles, electric vehicles, et cetera, so that the government planners are stepping up and saying, this is where we're going to drive the economy. And so this fundamental feature of transition that people didn't know where they were going seems to be being lost as government leaders increasingly feel confident that the successes of the past are telling them that they can guide into the future. And I think this is peculiar because if we think about each of these structural changes, it's true that from an economic standpoint, the structural changes have occurred and the pace of change is probably slowing down. But does that mean we don't need the same kind of transitional spirit? If we think about it, you think about the structural change, economy moves from agriculture to industry, but it doesn't stop there, does it? After an economy industrializes, it moves into the service economy. And China has all kinds of untapped potential to be a service giant, to be an information giant, to be an art and design giant, to be a food giant, to be an enormously creative economy in all kinds of ways that are related not to the industrial economy, but to the new emerging economies that are so important. China is aging, but as someone who's been there, believe me, the 30s and the 40s are better and more interesting than the 20s, and they require just as much creativity and just as much exploration. So one of the funny things we find about China today then is this new determination of the leadership to move away from this conception of transition that was exploratory. The leader of China today, Xi Jinping, has talked about, he doesn't use the term China model, but he talks about socialism with Chinese characteristics, and he says it presents a road to other countries. If they want to follow this road, they can grow faster and be more self-reliant. So in other words, the Chinese leader today, the most important leader, has moved away from this exploratory sense of transition. And we see it as well in the way that policymakers in China, who even several years ago or a decade ago were really trying as hard as possible to elicit a kind of consultative advice on how to make policy and what they should be doing. And increasingly that's narrowing, and they're less interested in hearing opinions from non-governmental organizations, from university experts. The policy process is narrower. There's more censorship in social media. That kind of flexibility and adaptability seems to be being reduced. So I think this is a bad thing. And I'm worried about it, not just for China, but for another reason that might surprise you. And that is, I think that the world needs China to be a leader. In other words, China has its experience with engaging with change is deeper and more profound in some sense than any other country. And as we face these absolutely unprecedented sets of changes, how's the economy going to change? How's work going to change? How are technologies transforming our existence? We need the engagement and creativity that China has established over the last 30 years with the transition process. You know, you hear all the time that the United States can't cope with a rising China. I don't believe it. I think if somebody tells you about the Thucydides trap and how we're destined for conflict, I'd say, look at them with a great deal of skepticism and say, is that the main part of the story? Because I suggest to you that it isn't the main part of the story. And I want to leave you with this paradox. China can be an important leader in the world. And the only thing that's missing is for China to abandon the idea that it already knows where we should be going. Thank you.